There are moments we carry that never make it into reports. Not the elbow that struck you in passing. Not the smirk that told you you wouldn't be believed. Not even the silence in a courtroom full of people who looked away not because they didn't see, but because they didn't want to. Camille Rhodes had trained her whole life to stay composed. In intelligence briefings, in war zones, in rooms where saying the wrong thing could cost lives. But nothing prepared her for the moment. Someone tried to erase her not by force, but by quiet calculation in the very place where truth was supposed to matter most. She didn't shout. She didn't break. She remembered, and that's where everything began to shift. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do in a broken system is refuse to disappear. So what really happened inside that courtroom in Detroit when power pressed against silence, and silence didn't fold? The courtroom felt colder than it should have, not in temperature, but in presence. Something about the air made people sit straighter, talk softer, breathe quieter, like they had stepped into a place where truth wasn't spoken so much as managed. Somewhere near the back of the room, Camille Rhodes adjusted the collar of her wool blazer and rested her hands on her lap. Her nails were short, clean, no rings, no bracelets. She didn't move much, didn't blink too often. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm, but from years of knowing movement, draws attention, and attention can be dangerous. Third row from the front, close enough to hear, far enough not to be seen. That was the position she always chose. It's where analysts sat in field briefings when they didn't have to speak but needed to remember everything. Her posture was precise, but not stiff. Her back didn't touch the wooden bench behind her. Her heels stayed grounded, knees at a soft angle, as if her body remembered how to survive a space that didn't want her in it. At the defense table sat her nephew, Marcus Rhodes, 32 years old, former early childhood education teacher, now stripped of everything that made people see him as safe. His suit was one size too large, borrowed from a neighbor. His wrists were still red where the cuffs had been too tight that morning. His face twitched in small ways, left eye blinking faster than the right, jaw flexing once every few seconds. He kept glancing back toward her. Each time he did, Camille offered nothing more than a slow blink or a subtle tilt of the head, not reassurance, just presence. Just proof that he wasn't in this alone. Across from them, in a pressed navy uniform with creases too sharp to be honest, sat Sergeant Gregory Nash, arms crossed. One leg ankle over knee in that fake casual posture, meant to convey boredom and control. He'd been in this courtroom before, too many times. He had a face that looked like it had practiced indifference in the mirror, a smirk that wasn't born, but built like armor. When the prosecutor leaned over to whisper something, he laughed. Not loud, but deliberately enough that it cut through the stillness like a spoon scraping metal. Camille didn't look at him, not directly, but he looked at her, eyes slow moving like a camera panning, then pausing just long enough to register recognition? No, not quite. Something else. Maybe annoyance. Maybe that strange itch of déjà vu when a shadow from your past shows up wearing civilian clothes. The judge hadn't entered yet. People were still shuffling in. A pair of law students scribbled on legal pads. A woman in a denim jacket whispered nervously to someone beside her. The clerk typed something mechanically. The buzz of a too-old ceiling fan turned slow and steady, like it was struggling to stay alive. Camille remained still. The courtroom doors swung open. The bailiff's voice rang out, almost bored. Case 204B, State of Michigan v. Marcus Rhodes. The murmurs faded like a light switch flipped. Papers stopped rustling. Chairs quit creaking. Marcus stood, slowly, as if the air had gotten heavier since he first sat down. Camille's hands tightened for a moment, not clenched, just closer together, wrists drawn in as if protecting something invisible. The chains on Marcus's ankles clinked faintly as he moved to the defense podium. That sound, the drag of metal against tile, punched the air like an insult nobody acknowledged. Then came the judge, gray-bearded, glasses thick enough to hide behind, robe slightly wrinkled. He didn't look up when he sat, just tapped the gavel once and muttered, "Let's proceed." Camille knew the process. She'd read enough transcripts in her past life to predict the beats. The defense would offer a motion, the prosecution would object, and the whole thing would roll forward like a train on rusty tracks. But then something shifted. "Your Honor," the young defense attorney said, her voice already straining to mask exhaustion, "we call Miss Camille Rhodes to the stand." For the first time, heads turned in her direction. Someone near the front whispered, "Who?" Camille rose, not quickly, not dramatically, just rose like breath quiet, measured, and unapologetic. She walked forward with the ease of someone who had memorized terrain before stepping on it. Not a single loose motion. The bailiff moved instinctively, almost straightening in response. As she passed Sergeant Nash, something barely visible flickered across his face. A memory? A warning? She didn't look at him. Camille took the witness stand without shifting her posture. She didn't scan the room, didn't check who was watching. Her name was stated clearly. Then, in the same even tone, she added, "Former Senior Intelligence Analyst, Office of Defense Assessment, Pentagon." It wasn't meant to impress. It wasn't bragging. It was contextual. She gave that information the same way someone might list allergies at a clinic. Relevant, but not emotional. The air in the room changed. No one gasped. No one spoke. But suddenly, people sat straighter. A stenographer lifted her head slightly. Even the judge paused for a beat too long before gesturing the defense to continue. Camille answered every question with the precision of someone who used to brief people whose lives depended on intel accuracy. What time Marcus picked her up, what they ate, which neighbor dropped off casserole. The name of the clinic where he went for food poisoning. All cross-referenced with receipts, timestamps, and security footage stills. No embellishment, no hesitation. Just the rhythm of truth, spoken like fact. When she was dismissed, she didn't linger. As she walked past the defense table, Marcus looked up. Her hand briefly touched his shoulder. 1 second, maybe 2. Then she kept walking. That was when it happened. Just as she reached the end of the aisle, Nash stood. He didn't say anything, didn't look at her. But his elbow flicked out just slightly, just enough. The contact was small but sharp. It caught her left arm, jolting her off balance. Not enough to fall, just enough to humiliate. The sound it made was barely audible, but the meaning was deafening. Camille didn't react. Not immediately. She stopped, planted her feet. One hand touched the wood of the gallery rail. Her face didn't change. But in that stillness, something cracked. Not inside her, but inside the room. A woman in the second row gasped. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. Even the bailiff turned his head. They'd seen it. They just didn't know what to do about it. Camille turned, looked toward the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even as polished marble, "may I speak?" The judge blinked, caught off guard, then nodded. And then, still standing at the center aisle, under that fluorescent wash of courtroom light, Camille spoke. "I've sat across warlords in northern Kandahar. I've parsed drone telemetry in real time during civilian evacuations. I've written briefings that saved people who never knew my name. But I have never been struck by a law enforcement officer in my own country, inside a court of law, while defending a family member." The room held its breath. Nash didn't look at her. Not now. His smirk had gone. Camille's voice remained calm, not loud, not cracked, just undeniable. The truth is not loud. It doesn't need to be. But when ignored, it echoes louder than any lie. No one responded, because there was nothing left to say. They didn't take a recess after Camille spoke. The judge cleared his throat, asked the bailiff to note her statement for the record, and moved on like the air hadn't just shifted, like a woman hadn't just been assaulted in front of half the courtroom. Camille returned to her seat without another word. Her hand brushed her blazer, where Nash had hit her out of habit. Not pain. There wouldn't be bruises. That wasn't the point. The bruise wasn't on the skin. It was in the silence of everyone who saw and said nothing. Marcus didn't look back this time. He stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the table, jaw tight. Camille's presence was supposed to help him feel protected. But all it had done was provoke something that had been waiting, quietly, for an opening. Gregory Nash sat back in his chair with the arrogance of a man who'd tested the waters and found them warm. His legs crossed again. His eyes wandered. He even yawned, as if to say, "This won't go anywhere." He had been here before accused, investigated, and always returned to uniform unscathed. A flick of the wrist, a misplaced file, a conveniently absent witness. Camille had read about men like him, but she hadn't expected to meet one this close. Not again. Not here. She watched as the prosecutor began a line of questioning designed not to find the truth, but to shake the truth loose from Marcus's credibility. It was subtle, strategic, legal gymnastics. "Mr. Rhodes, is it true you were suspended from your teaching position before this incident?" Objection. Sustained. But the implication had landed. "Mr. Rhodes, can you explain why the security footage shows you leaving your apartment alone at 10:37 p.m.? He had already explained he went to take out the trash. The neighbor had confirmed it. The timestamp lined up with Camille's airport arrival, but the tone in the prosecutor's voice wasn't seeking confirmation. It was planting seeds. Seeds of instability. Seeds that black men in courtrooms were all too familiar with. Marcus hesitated, just half a second. But hesitation in a courtroom is louder than confession. He tried to recover, tried to answer clearly, but the crack had formed. Camille closed her eyes, not in defeat, in calculation. She had sat through enough Senate hearings and intelligence reviews to know when truth was becoming inconvenient. And in this room, her truth was inconvenient. She thought of the way the defense attorney, a young woman named Dana, barely past 30, had clutched her notepad like a life vest. Dana had tried, no doubt. She believed Marcus. But belief wasn't evidence. And in this system, evidence only counted if it played well on a screen, or matched the assumptions already loaded in the judge's head. Camille remembered something her father once told her, years ago, before his arrest. "The system isn't broken, baby. It was built this way. That's the part they never write down." The prosecutor pivoted to Camille's testimony, subtly framing her relationship with Marcus as a conflict of emotional proximity. "Miss Rhodes is a highly intelligent individual with a commendable past. But isn't it possible her memory is colored by her love for her nephew?" Camille didn't flinch, didn't blink, but inside, something recoiled. They weren't questioning her facts. They were questioning her legitimacy, her ability to observe, her capacity to tell the truth without distortion. She thought about what it meant to be too close to matter and too distant to be trusted, about how women like her were always too much or not enough, too cold to connect, too warm to be objective. The judge let the line of questioning stand. Later in the hallway, Dana would apologize for not pushing back harder. Camille would say nothing, not because she forgave her, but because she understood her. They were all just trying to survive in a system that mistook silence for order. After the court adjourned for the day, Camille didn't leave immediately. She sat on the bench outside the courtroom, watching the tile floor as if it might offer answers. Marcus joined her a few minutes later, his coat half-buttoned, tie loosened, hands trembling. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. When he finally did, his voice was rough, like he'd swallowed gravel. "They offered me a deal." Camille turned her head. He was staring straight ahead. 3 years, suspended sentence, probation after 15 months if I plead guilty. She waited. "They said it's the best I'll get. They said I'm not sympathetic enough for a jury." That word, sympathetic, like innocence, could be measured by likability. "They said," he trailed off, voice cracking, "they said I look too calm, that it makes me seem cold, like I don't care." Camille breathed in slow. He finally looked at her. "What if I take it?" She studied his face. The boy she raised wasn't a boy anymore, but just then he looked 12 again, like the night he found out his mother wasn't coming back from rehab. "If you didn't do it," she said quietly, "then pleading guilty doesn't end the sentence. It just hides it inside you, forever." He bit his lip. "They said I shouldn't testify, that my silence reads like guilt." She paused, then said, "Silence is not guilt, but they've trained the world to think it is." He looked away, ashamed. "I just don't want to die in there, Aunt Cam." She nodded slowly. "And I don't want you to disappear out here." That night, Camille sat alone in her apartment, staring at the yellow envelope that held Nash's personnel record. She had accessed it months ago, quietly, using contacts she no longer admitted to having. 6 prior complaints, 2 settlements, 3 disciplinary hearings, no terminations. She thought of all the names not in that file, all the men who'd never come forward, all the ones who had and been erased. Camille didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. She just opened her laptop, pulled up a blank document, and typed 4 words. "This is not over." Then she closed the screen and sat there in the quiet, because sometimes the only way to hear the truth again was to outwait the echo of the lie. The printer in the back room of the law library stuttered, clicked, then groaned to life. Dana's interna, second-year law student named Isaiah Kelly waited until the last page rolled out before he scooped up the packet. His fingers trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of what he knew he was holding. A copy of the hallway surveillance footage from the Wayne County Courthouse. Footage that was not in the official discovery file. Footage someone had labeled corrupt file, unreadable, and buried in a mislabeled directory inside a shared server no one had touched in over a year. Except Isaiah had, not because someone told him to, but because something about the smirk on Sergeant Nash's face during court hadn't sat right. It reminded him of his uncle's arrest 5 years earlier. The way power sometimes smiles at you before it crushes your bones. He didn't send the footage to the defense team. He didn't take it to the media. He printed it. He took a hard copy frame-by-frame stills, time-stamped and slid it into a plain brown folder. And then he walked it to Camille's apartment. When Camille opened the door that evening, she looked tired, but not surprised, like she'd been waiting for a knock that hadn't come yet. Isaiah didn't say much, just handed her the folder. "This wasn't deleted," he said, voice low. "It was hidden." Camille didn't thank him, not because she wasn't grateful, but because gratitude wasn't the point. She closed the door slowly behind him and sat down at her kitchen table. It was the same table Marcus had drawn dinosaurs on as a child. Same chipped corner, same faint ink stains under the wood grain. She opened the folder and began to scan the printouts. There it was. Frame 234, Camille walking down the aisle. Frame 236, Nash rising. Frame 238, his left elbow angling out. Frame 239, contact. Frame 240, Camille jolting. Frame 241, his face. She paused on that one, not because it was the clearest, but because it was the most telling. Nash wasn't sneering. He wasn't angry. He looked satisfied. That's what struck her, the expression of a man who'd done exactly what he meant to, and believed no one would ever hold him to it. Camille exhaled through her nose, then stood and walked to the drawer where she kept her old files. She pulled out a manila envelope labeled simply, Nash. She'd started it back in 2021, when she first heard his name through a closed-door ethics review at a federal oversight committee. Back then, she had flagged his pattern. Low-income neighborhoods, young black men, charges that fell apart in court, but only after months in holding. Nothing stuck, but everything stank. And yet, he'd survived every review, promoted even, because men like Nash weren't designed to break the system. They were part of its architecture. The next day, Camille returned to the courthouse. She didn't tell anyone what she was carrying. The courtroom felt different that morning, tighter, as if the walls had shifted closer. Marcus was already seated when she arrived. His eyes were dull, unfocused, his face slack with resignation. Camille leaned in. "I need you to hold," she whispered. He didn't answer. The judge entered, flipping through paperwork with mechanical detachment. The prosecutor was different, today older, more formal. There was a tension under his tone that hadn't been there yesterday. "Before we proceed," he said, "we were informed late last night that supplemental evidence had been submitted to the court regarding Officer Nash's conduct during the trial." Camille didn't react. Neither did Marcus. But Nash shifted. Not much, just a small twitch of the jaw, a blink too slow. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "We respectfully request a brief review of that material before continuing with direct examination." The judge nodded and asked that the monitor be turned toward the bench. Camille watched, silent, as the footage played. No commentary. No voiceover. Just grainy black and white film. The elbow, the hit, the stagger, and Nash's face. The room didn't erupt. No gasps, no yelling, just an oppressive silence that settled like snow on stone. When the footage ended, the judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "Sergeant Nash," he said, his voice calm but edged with something cold, "please step out of the courtroom until this matter is reviewed in chambers." Nash didn't argue. He stood, walked out. But before he reached the door, he paused, looked at Camille, and for the first, timidly with contempt, not with smugness, but with calculation. Like he had underestimated her, and now he didn't know where the ground was. Outside the courtroom, reporters had already gathered. Camille stayed seated. Marcus turned toward her slowly. "Did you send it?" She shook her head. "No." He blinked. "Then who did?" She didn't answer. Because it didn't matter. The truth had made it in. And for the first time since all this began, Marcus sat upright. Not because he believed everything would be okay, but because something impossible had happened. He had been seen. That evening, Camille stood on the rooftop of her building. The skyline of Detroit stretched out in the distance, glowing with that hard kind of beauty cities have after too many winters and too few repairs. The folder lay open on a chair beside her, its contents weighted down with a rock. She didn't need it anymore. The story had begun to shift. And she knew, deep down, this wasn't over. There would be pushback, retaliation, reframing. But this moment, this tiny ripple, in a courtroom built to absorb shocks, meant something. Sometimes change didn't start with protests. Sometimes it started with a single page that wasn't supposed to exist, landing in the right hands. There was no press conference, no explosive exposé, no crowd outside the courthouse that morning, just the hush of winter settling early over Detroit's sidewalks, and the distant hum of traffic drifting in with the wind. Inside, the courtroom was unusually full, not because of the case itself, but because people had begun to whisper. They'd seen the footage. The elbow, the smirk, the still frame that landed harder than a gavel ever could. But no one said the words aloud. Not yet. Marcus sat quietly at the defense table, his shoulders no longer hunched but not quite lifted, somewhere between survival and belief. Camille was there before anyone else, third row again, just like the first day, back straight, hands folded, the same gray blazer, the same quiet. She didn't need to move to own the room. She'd already done that with silence, with poise, with facts. But today was different. Because today, they asked her to speak again. The judge cleared his throat. He looked tired not from age, but from weight, the kind of fatigue that comes from finally seeing what you didn't want to see. He turned to Camille. "Miss Rhodes, if you wish, you may address the court before we move forward with motions regarding the suppression of Officer Nash's testimony." Dana, the defense attorney, turned slightly, not to pressure, just to signal, "It's yours if you want it." Camille stood slowly. The wood of the bench creaked slightly as she rose, but otherwise the room was still. No one whispered. No one shifted. Even the ceiling fan had gone quiet. She walked down the center esplanade fast, not hesitant, like every step was part of a rhythm only she could hear. When she reached the front, she didn't face the judge. Not yet. She turned to Nash. He was seated by the wall now, flanked by legal counsel. his uniform replaced by a civilian suit, a clip-on tie, too tight at the neck. His smirk was gone, but the remnants of his defiance hung just behind his eyes, like dust on glass. Camille looked at him for a full 5 seconds. Then she spoke, not loudly, not with tremor, just with that quiet that makes people lean in. "Sergeant Nash," she began, "you once set off record, of course, that silence is compliance." She paused. "And yet, it wasn't my silence that failed you. It was your assumption that mine meant surrender." A breath caught somewhere in the gallery. Camille's gaze didn't falter. "You see, there's a difference between being quiet and being absent, between not reacting and not remembering. And the danger of a man like you is not that you wield force, but that you mistake stillness for fear." Nash shifted in his chair. Camille didn't blink. "You struck me not because I was loud, but because I was still, because I didn't cower, because I reminded you of every truth that wouldn't stay buried." Her voice dropped slightly, not dramatic, but grounded. "But here's the part you never learned." She turned slightly toward the gallery, toward the court, but never broke eye contact. "Some of us don't raise our voices, because we've already written the record." The room was silent, not stunned, stilled, like someone had drawn a line through the air and dared the system to cross it again. Camille stepped back, not rushed, just complete. The judge looked down, adjusted his glasses, didn't speak for a long moment. Nash said nothing. He couldn't. There was no rebuttal to what wasn't an accusation, but an unveiling. Later that day, the judge struck Nash's entire testimony from the record, referred his conduct to the State Ethics Board, and recessed the court for review of all prior arrests tied to his name. It wasn't a victory parade. It was paperwork. But in Camille's world, that was the loudest kind of justice. As she left the courthouse, a journalist, young, eager, holding a mic that still smelled of fresh plastic, caught up to her. "Ms. Rhodes," he asked breathlessly, "do you have a message for those watching this unfold across the country?" Camille didn't stop walking, but she turned her head just slightly and said, with the calm of someone who had already decided, "You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to speak in a way the silence can't ignore." Then she kept walking, because her work here wasn't to be admired. It was to be finished. 3 months later, the courtroom was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't for a trial. It was a panel. Simple plastic nameplates on a folding table. No gavels, no bailiffs, just 60 chairs filled with students, city workers, and community members in the basement of the Detroit Public Library. The flyer had called it Power, Silence, and Systems, a conversation on how justice actually works. At the center sat Camille Rhodes. She wore no blazer that day, just a navy sweater and soft brown slacks, her hair pulled back simply, the same stillness in her posture but softer now. Not because the world had gotten gentler, but because she had learned how to carry it differently. Behind her, pinned to the corkboard, was a black and white photo of her father, taken in 1982, 6 months before he was wrongly imprisoned for fraud. He'd died, waiting for an appeal that never came. Camille never brought up his name during the discussion. But he was there. In every sentence she weighed before speaking. In every student who leaned forward, pen ready. In every pause she let breathe before the next truth drop. Marcus sat near the back. No suit, just jeans and a button-down. He now worked with a community literacy group helping kids who couldn't sit still in traditional classrooms. Sometimes, he said, it felt like teaching ghosts how to speak. Kids who'd already been labeled, forgotten, shelved. But they listened to him. Because he didn't talk down. Because he knew what it was like to have no one believe you, even when you were telling the truth as clearly as you could. He hadn't said much since the case was dismissed. But today, his eyes never left Camille. Near the end of the event, a woman from the audience, maybe late 40s, with a sharp red scarf and the calm urgency of a former teacher, raised her hand. She didn't speak right away. When Camille nodded to her, she stood. "I don't want to ask about the trial," the woman said. Or the officer. Or even your past work. I want to ask you this. If you had the chance to say one thing to the man who tried to humiliate you, the man who misused his badge to strip you of dignity, what would you say? The room held its breath. Not because it was waiting for anger, but because it expected wisdom. Camille looked down at the tabletop. Her fingers moved slowly, tracing the edge of her paper cup. She let the silence linger not awkwardly, but intentionally, like she was giving everyone time to prepare for the truth. Then she looked up, straight into the woman's eyes, and said, I'd tell him this power doesn't reveal who you are when you have it. It reveals who you allow yourself to be when you think no one's watching. She let it sit. Just that. No follow-up. No elaboration. And the weight of it filled every corner of the room. Because it wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about every person who'd ever held a title and used it as a shield. Every boss who'd weaponized silence. Every official who'd chosen procedure over people. And every system that still taught those lessons, quietly, generation after generation. After the event, Camille didn't stay for photos. She helped stack chairs. Spoke briefly to a young woman who said she wanted to go to law school but was scared of becoming part of the machine. Camille had smiled and replied, Then stay close to the broken parts. They'll keep you human. That night, Marcus cooked dinner. Just the two of them. Baked salmon, roasted carrots, jasmine rice. No occasion, no cameras, just steam rising in a quiet kitchen and the scent of garlic softening in oil. They didn't speak much over the meal. But after, as they rinsed plates and let water run, Marcus paused, looked at her. You know what's funny? He said, drying a bowl. Some days I still expect someone to knock on the door and take it all back. Camille didn't laugh, but she placed her hand gently over his, not to silence him, but to anchor him. You're not who they said you were, she whispered. You never were. He nodded, slowly. Then, and you? Camille turned off the faucet, looked out the kitchen window. Outside, snow had just begun to fall. Tiny flakes, almost invisible, but steady. She exhaled. I stopped trying to prove who I am the moment they tried to erase me. That's when I remembered truth doesn't need permission to exist. Later that week, a small mural was painted near Eastern Market. It showed a woman standing not on a podium, not in the spotlight, but in the third row of a courtroom. Her hand rested on her lap, her eyes forward, and behind her, faint but clear, were the words, She didn't speak to be loud, she spoke to be remembered. No one tagged Camille on social media when the mural went up, but she saw it. On a morning walk, she paused, let the wind push her scarf against her shoulder. Then she kept walking, because dignity isn't what you wear on the outside. It's what you leave behind when you finally choose silence as your last word. Have you ever sat in a room where your truth didn't seem to matter? Where your presence felt like a whisper in a place built to reward echoes that didn't sound like yours? Camille's story is not just about justice in a courtroom. It's about the strength it takes to hold your dignity when the world tries to file it away as irrelevant. It's about choosing stillness, not because you're afraid, but because you know silence, when grounded in truth, can shift more than words ever will. Maybe you've been there. Maybe not in a courthouse, but in a job interview, a family conversation, a school hallway where someone looked at you and assumed your quiet meant weakness. If you have, let this story remind you. You are not invisible. You are not alone. And your silence does not mean surrender. We hope Camille's journey sparked something in you, maybe a memory, maybe a feeling, maybe just the quiet kind of courage you didn't know you needed. If it did, we'd love for you to subscribe, share this episode with someone who needs it, and leave us a comment with your thoughts. We read every word, because stories like this, they don't just need to be heard, they need to be carried. She didn't speak to be loud, she spoke to be remembered. We'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.